Unfortunately, we had a number of people that couldn't travel, visas, you know, United States politics at the moment. But very happy to have you here and to start this second ILPC Congress in Latin America. Some of you have been in Buenos Aires and remember that experience. Please don't compare. No, because there are good and bads in any edition of this conference. Well, we are going to have a few words from the dean of my faculty. So I'm calling to the podium Eduardo Saavedra. For a few words of welcome, and then, well, the microphone will be again for me and for introducing you to the keynote speaker, which is sitting here in front of me, Carlos Martins, which will be discussed by Sergio Santibáñez from the Directorate of Labor. So, Eduardo, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to welcome you, not just to the 43rd edition of the International Labor Process Conference, hosted our Faculty of Economics and Business at Alberto Hurtado University, but welcome to Chile, a land of breathtaking landscapes, as you may experience by observing the Andes, maybe, when you arrive here. We are proud of our world-class wine. I'm pretty sure that you know that what I'm talking about, and our seafood. I hope you can taste in some moment during your stay here. Some of you have crossed continents, oceans. I mean, you come from very far to be here, and while we could spend the whole conference debating whether the pisco sour is better the Chileans or the Perus. Maybe you know the answer. You have actually come here for something even more important, to think, to debate, and to shape solutions in the face of a pivotal and at times threatening global conjuncture. The discussions and reflections that will take place here regarding labor processes in a global context of rapid technological change, environmental crisis, and an ongoing reconfiguration of the world order are of utmost importance. The accelerated transformation of labor paradigms, driven not only by technological advancement that progressively replace human effort, but also by the impacts of climate change on the location and organization of productive forces, as well as by an international economic order under scrutiny, compel us to engage in a profound dialogue about the role and situation of workers in this complex and ever-changing landscape. From the social function of labor, historically understood as a primary means of connection and legitimacy of individuals within society, as a key element in the pursuit of social justice, and as an irreplaceable factor in progress, we know, but find ourselves questioning its very viability in the societies of the future. All of this underscores the significance of debates like the one we begin today. The search for ways in which labor remains crucial for the recognition of people, their dignity, and their rights is a complex challenge, as it requires proposing new frameworks that redefine the identity and value of work in these new times. Elements such as human rights in labor, essential for ensuring equality and dignity, as well as the protection of collective rights, so that organized workers can make their voice heard, are becoming increasingly relevant in a world where specific norms and regulations risk rapid obsolescence in the face of the dizzying pace of change in productive processes. In short, the challenge is as difficult as it is exciting. It will demand both imagination and scientific rigor, as well as a deep engagement with the rich exchange of experiences and knowledge that this conference offers. This is both a welcome and an expression of hope. We trust that the outcomes of this event will powerfully and creatively contribute to an urgent reflection on labor and the kind of work we want to build and leave for future generations. As we begin this journey together, let's raise the bar, both intellectually and later perhaps with a glass of Carmenere, because while the stakes are high, the power of ideas shared in an academic conference is our greatest leverage. Thank you very much. Welcome again.
Well, many thanks to Eduardo, our dean. Next is then Carlos Martins, our keynote for today. He's going to talk about, I'm going to read the title, technological transformation, accumulation patterns, geopolitical disputes, and the world of work in the long 21st century. Carlos Eduardo Martins from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Carlos, please.
Es un gusto muy grande estar aquí. Yo voy a hablar en portuñol y es un prazer inmenso estar en esta... ¿Perdón? Ah, perfecto. ¿Americano que sería inglés? No, no.
You need to get the headphones for the translation, which are over there.
No. I apologize for my English, but I couldn't try to speak in English because it's not so great, my English. I can start? Okay? Yeah. Es un prazer muito grande estar aqui nesta conferência organizada, não é, por ILO, por la International Labour Process Conference. Mi tema será apresentar os grandes cambios que se desarrollan en el mundo contemporáneo y su vinculación con el proceso productivo, el proceso de acumulación y las relaciones de trabajo. Yo haría un primer planteamiento, que es que nosotros estamos viviendo un período de caos sistémico, un período de empate catastrófico en el mundo, del punto de vista geopolítico y de las relaciones de poder.
And this means that we are facing a crisis not only regarding an hegemony of the United States on the Atlanticism, but also a crisis which is a deep crisis of capitalist civilization. That crisis is expressed in several evidences. One of them is the leadership of the world comes from Occident to Asia, from the Western world to Asia, and the other sign is that Anglo-Saxon countries are losing their capacity to lead the world economy. And another dimension is that the political liberalism starts to have and suffer a deep crisis. The determinant factors of this process, we can find the question of the scientific and technological revolution. We understand capitalism as a system that went through three main structural phases in historical processes. The first stage was the stage of the primitive accumulation mentioned by Marx that took 3 centuries, where capital created a system that was led mainly by the commercial capital and the money capital, but kept a political leadership in partnership with nobility, medieval aristocracy. So the capital entered in a second structural time that Marx considered that there's a time where he developed his own means of production or ways of production, which is the Industrial Revolution. And in this phase, capital imposed liberal revolutions, and through these industrial revolutions, it also imposed the plus value or added value as an axis of the accommodation process around the world. The added value or plus value is based on the difference between the value contributed by labor and the value paid to the workforce. Sorry. Plus value depends that technology relatively disqualifies the workforce faced to the productive process. And the Industrial Revolution did this organization, created this disqualification process in a great way, and intensified manual labor, concentrated intellectual work in a few people and introduced the machines as a way of substitution of workforces in the productive process. Then this process had progressed until it entered a new stage from the 70s onwards in the 20th century, which is the scientific and technological revolution. And the scientific and technological revolution is a process where automation starts to be imposed in the productive process. And this scientific and technical revolution has the capacity to do a deep change, create a deep change in the occupation of labor, as the Industrial Revolution did. The Industrial Revolution took people out of the country and took them to the great urban areas, and it decreased the work applied to agriculture areas. And in the scientific and technical revolution, it tends to do this with the manual work. Scientific and technological revolution tends to dramatically reduce the time of work available for manual work. This is a process that started in the 70s, reducing abruptly the workforce in the industries, and now it's advancing and progressing towards the services, automating the services as well. But the scientific and technological revolution, putting this abrupt reduction of manual work, creates a new foundation for productive forces, for developing productive forces, which is the intellectual work, the overall and generalization of intellectual work. Then the axis of this latest revolution is nothing but the devaluation of the workforce, but on the other side is the valuation of the workforce, because the education and training time, it's a key element of the value of the workforce. So what this revolution has made is to transform education and qualifications into an unlimited time, and to link the productivity to qualifications, to increasing qualifications of the workforce. That puts a crisis for the plus value rate, because the plus value rate depended on the opposite, that technology would devaluate the workforce. And now we have the other way around. We have a situation where the dynamic of productive forces is not in the physical technology, but the dynamic of productive forces is located in the accumulation and development of knowledge, and the accumulation and development of knowledge superiority. So that creates a paradox to the process of capitalist accumulation, and it's very interesting to see this in the work of Marx. For Marx, it was very clear that the trend of the decreasing to decreasing rate of income, it was because the industrial process created automation in the productive forces and reduced the number or the mass of manual work involved in the works. And for Marx, it's also clear that science is a productive force, because capital can use the science as well as they use pre-capitalist productive forces. But actually, science as a structure of productive forces is a post-capitalist productive force, because it depends on the value or valorization of workforce. And how is capital linked to this process? How is capital related to these transformations? Well, capital starts to from the 70s in the U.S. that was still leading the world accumulation at the time. In the U.S., they started to structure a double process: funding of accumulation and delocalization of productive processes. So the idea was to expand this overexploitation of workforces to the great urban centers. And what does this do? The overexploitation of workforce pays a price to the worker for its workforce below the real value of it. And it does this, creating structural unemployment and putting the price of workforces below the value. So for Marx, the price of workforce, it's equivalent to the value in a situation of balance between demand and offer. If you create a disbalance, a disbalance is where the prices go below the value. So another way to do this is to use the workforce overexploited or much lower prices of the marginal areas as a regulated access of salaries in countries. So with this strategy, the United States bourgeoisie defeated the working class in the 60s and 70s. These years are years of an offensive of the workforce in North America and Europe, looking for redistribution of the surplus in favor of the salaries, of social expenses. But the great bourgeoisie in U.S. defeats the working classes, and that is very clear if we look at the level of inequality that started to be developed in the US and Europe from the 80s. If we take, for example, the data from Oxfam, states that from the generated income per capita in the US from the 80s onwards, barely 2% were for the 50% of the poorest the poorest layers. So the increase of inequality in the US is brutal, and in Europe is also brutal, but also there is a technological decline of these power centers. The US, on financing their economy, decreased productive investment, and on unlocalizing the economy, decreased productive investment in their national industry. And the result is the economic and technological decline of the US and an increasing loss of their advantage in terms of the international division of labor. And it opens spaces for the appearance of new competitors, such as China, for example. U.S. created, with this financing of their economy, a public debt that was completely different from the previous period. That was a period where they looked for full employment of productive forces. The public debt increased in the period of the Second World War, went from 50% to 120% of the GDP, but it was the idea behind was to create employment. But the unemployment of the 30s went to 2% after the Second World War, and then the debt that increased after the Second World War from 50% to 120% of GDP started to fall up to the 30% of GDP at the end of the 70s. with the financing of the economy, this movement was the opposite. The public debt went from 30 to 60% in the 80s, then from 60% to 100% in the 90s until 2010. And now the public debt is around 130%. So U.S. became an economy that is a parasitic economy, and a parasitic economy that promoted the ideology of austerity around the world, because this was about financing the public debt of the U.S. And in order to finance the public debt, the countries couldn't promote their own national domestic projects of development. So then, with this neoliberal globalization, a brutal process of precarization of the workforce was created in the Western economies, and a brutal process of deindustrialization in the Western countries and in Latin America, a deindustrialization that doesn't have to do with the technological transition, but it has to do with the question of submission to the process of the U.S., because Latin America took dollars through international capitals to promote their development, and it was surprised with the increasing rates, interest rates, that created a colossal external debt and an internal debt in order to fund that external debt. So what is seen and observed here in the period of neoliberal globalization is the decadence of the U.S., a continuous decadence that it was funded by international capitals. China enters this stage as a strong exporter of merchandise for world economies, for the U.S., initially lowering the production costs of transnational companies in the U.S. But when China puts very clearly, or states very clearly, that they didn't have as a goal to be a platform of export for the U.S., but also they wanted to promote their own development project and to look for dispute the technology frontiers of the world, when China puts this very clearly with the Made in China 2025. The U.S. changed the relationship with China. China quits or stops being invited to be part of the international American pacts, and it starts to be or to become a threat. The U.S. has controlled the negative effects of the parasitic policy that were manifested in a huge commercial deficit, and the effects were under control on the main partners with the military partnerships like Japan and Germany that had important commercial superavits in the 80s and 90s. U.S. was able to control that, forcing Germany and Japan to value in their own in his currency, in dollars. But with China, they couldn't do this. China took advantage of the fact that Japan and Germany valued in the U.S. to do the contrary movement, to devalue theirs and establish a fixed parity with U.S. dollars. And then China took the commercial superavit against the U.S. for their own development. And China, with the Made in China 2025. They're looking for a plan that is in the middle of the international technology frontier until 2049. Now they want to be leading in technology in 2049. So China has developed a very strong process of technological modernization and quickly started to take advantage and overcome US in different fields. For example, China in century 21 overcame US in international patent. China was able to break the trend to prevent their development by the DeepSeek chatbot. And the DeepSeek chatbot is based on the qualification of the Chinese workforce that allowed China to do much more with much less. Although US tried to block the provision of hardware for China in order not to develop their technology of their artificial intelligence technology. But what China demonstrated is that this investment in qualification of the workforce is an advantage that is a concrete technological advantage. If we look at the consequences of this model, of these accumulation models, of capital accumulation models in China and the US for workers, an effect of this for the policy of the US is the de-unionization of workers in a rate that was brutally descending, and in Europe as well, decreasing. So the political leadership was developed that is called extreme center. That a political leadership that has a very little difference between center-left and center-right, because both of them support this process of globalization, neoliberal globalization, that funds, that decrease, makes the economy funding, decrease the productive workforce, that decrease the processes of productive forces. And what happened in the US and Europe is that a complete fall of unionization, the decline of social democracy, and an opening of spaces for fascism to appear, because there was no left to really become an alternative to those processes of accumulation. If we look at China, what is happening in terms of unionization is a very different situation. In China, the unionization rate is very high. It's true that there is a union linked to the Communist Party, of course, but the unionization rate is 50% of the workforce in China, and at least from 2010 to this day, what we have seen is that salaries in China started to overcome productivity. That has to do with technological changes in China and with the fact that, especially in the information technology area, there is a change in salaries regarding productivity. So in China, there is this process of accumulation that reverts production, that generates productive changes, that increases qualification of the workforce, and that generates a political force of potential transformation that is still developing and occurring.
China also is developing a project in organizing international relationships based on the emergence and articulation of the global south, and which is within the horizon that China aims at looking for a shared community for humanity with the development of, which I stated, this is something which is cooperative in nature among different countries in different levels. For example, the Silk Route, the Belt Route is several countries linking together. These statements from the 90s onwards, from the globalization, he's seen as something which stated a consensus of Washington then, given the axis of public policies throughout the world, and this process of organizes through China in this instead is a process much more inclusive in nature, and a process which places or evidences the organization, particularly through the BRICS, given the countries which are these countries are big countries, large surface area, large demographies, which have maritime efforts, and so the hegemony created, given capitalism, was always a hegemony of peninsulas, isles in the coasts, and peninsular in nature. That was the hegemony of the Iberian Peninsula, Holland, England, the U.S. hegemony, as seen as an island country, if we can see that. The Pacific and the Atlantic, you have those both coasts. Now we have an articulation of these amphibious countries, large demographies, large territorial areas, and also which are strong maritime inheritance. In this way, you have a mass which is always central to the capital in political spaces which has been hitherto isolated to social pressures, which have a geopolitical axis which is strongly dense in demographic terms and strongly capable of articulating social pressures on political leadership, on its political leadership. The U.S. seeks to impede the development of this geopolitical axis, abandons formal imperialisms in the neoliberal globalization, and Trump was not a point outside the curve, let's say. There's a tendency in international relations. If the U.S. tries to destroy these multipolar tendencies which are seen in the world, seeking to submit them to their own protocols. They tried, for example, to destroy Russia, and the possibility of creating a space, Eurasian space, with the Ukrainian war, and failed terribly. The result of the war in Ukraine was clearly the expansion of BRICS. BRICS have been reduced to 5 countries, and they started to expand strongly, which is a clear signal that the global south is going to articulate itself in favor of changes towards multipolarity. The question then of dollarization of world economy is we seek an alternative, monetary alternative, in terms of reform, and the organizations, international organizations, in international relations, and we seek alternatives in issues relating to insurance frameworks, and this scenario, which is seen, is still not strong enough for a new order to come to force, But the scenario is clearly visible where there's a power which doesn't conceive to have a world order, and there's another power emergent which is strengthening itself but still not strong enough to change world relationships. And Latin America, where is it in this process? It has links with this multipolar world, and it is a region which is deeply submitted or under the influence of the US. It's a region which did not finish its industrial cycle because it was skewed by external pressure. It's a region which industrialized precociously, and it's a region which assumed or took on an ideology of austerity, fiscal austerity, with lots of depth. This has effects whose solution is a reorganization in the work process, a lowering in the trade union rates, the social democracy in Latin America is revealed as a social democracy, and there is no of difficulties in generating a multipolar project in social change, such that Latin America is in a process whereby it's clearly in a crisis of political leadership, crisis in ideologies, and the possibilities of clearly there. But Latin America is facing this enormous process of technological change, which requires a growth in state expansion, state size. If we look at for example, the changes in the state at the beginning of the 20th century, if we see that, we can see that the story of capitalism, each change, regulatory change, changes incremented significantly the expense that the state did given the people. The first decade of the 20th century, the public expenditure of the main international powers was between 5-10% of the GDP. Then, after the Second World War, the public expenditure of the state was 20%, around that. In the neoliberal era, the public state was around 40%. And we are dealing with this transition, technological transition, in order for the new stage of the IT and the new stage of biotechnologies, and which requires, what this new stage requires as technological change, what it requires is an enormous expense in science, in health, in education, in ecological protection, and that is a virtuous alternative of the pressure to increase public expenditure. And capital tries to reduce this possibility and deviate public expenditure towards finding such that the creditors will be the great beneficiaries in budgeting allocation. So now, for war purposes, pursuing war trade, we in Latin America, we want to promote is an alliance, political alliance, with sectors of the labor force which are ever more linked to this new technological framework, and in the sectors at the forefront in the labor force are workers of the service sector, workers in health service sectors, education, culture. These forces, post-industrial forces, has much more public vocation. For example, the industrial forces during the industrial process, what would produce resources, individual resources. In this technical scientific revolution, what is produced is public services, health, education, culture, ecological protection. This is it falls within this framework of technological transformation. For us, for example, in Brazil, we have a difference in that. We can see that the great networks in Brazil in decades past were promoted by workers of education, workers in the health sector. So I am of the opinion that in Latin America we need to create an alliance within workers, with workers, where we should have the forefront the role of health workers, workers in education, workers in science, put them at the forefront and emphasize in this group, in this sector, and their relationship with the great mass of people overexploited, precarious in their living conditions, subject to unemployment. And this relationship should be at the leading edge of which would depend on a political vanguard which promotes a national and international project of social relationships, decisive social relationships. This project will not come from the union forces, but it requires alignment with the state. It requires a mediation with a political vanguard which is dissimilar from the political vanguard which is currently in force in Latin America, which this political vanguard is still very much linked to liberal ideologies of austerity, which was very present in the last decades of Latin America. I have spoken quite a lot, very many issues that I've presented. I thank your patience and your attention. Thank you.
Gracias, Carlos.
We would like to move to the living room because we are now in the phase of the discussion, debate. So we are going to have a few initial comments from Sergio Santibáñez, Catalan. Sergio is the regional director of the Labor Directorate, that for those that are not familiar with Chile is the labor inspection institution of the country. So they play a very important role in terms of labor regulation and labor inspection. So I call both of you to have a seat here. So there will be a first round of comments from Sergio, and then we will open for a question and answer the rest of the session till 11. At 11, coffee outside.
¿Comienzo? Hola, muy buenos días.
Good morning.
Soy Sergio Santibáñez.
Sergio Santibáñez. I represent the working director of Chile in charge of the compliance of labor regulations and safety and health at work. This institution has been for centuries working. We turned 100 last year. This year will be 101 anniversary, and in our 100 years is not just something trivial, but we have an institution that is state, labor, and regulates the contradiction of capital and work for 100 years. But also to relate it to what Carlos mentioned in his presentation, it's not a casualty that our institution started in 1924. It's not casual that the Congress and the Republic at the time, that was an oligarchy, decided that it was necessary to regulate the exploitation of labor and it was necessary to regulate the exploitation of workers. Historical processes were happening at the time, and there was an increase in the fights of the workforce unionized at the world level, not only in the Western world, but something very transcendental that was very close to the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution of 1917, together with the First World War, started what was called the short 20th century, the brief 20th century. These events reconfigured until so to the present the relationship between capital and work and labor, and how this is expressed in our social life. We could say that those events, the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the Second World War, generated a new world, a change in the order of those in those years, and we are now faced to a new world order as well. When you look at what is happening around the world with the increase of ultra-right, deregulation, techno-feudalism, as some call it, you can understand that it's a change of times that looks like apocalyptic. But we need to remember that the last change of the epoch wasn't better, much better. The change of the order didn't end with 2 world wars. So you could estimate that the new world orders, then these changes in the flow of capital and the capitalistic domination in terms of imperialistic fights, because nowadays work is something, this is a question I would like to develop with you now. Labor doesn't seem to have a place in this dispute. It seems that we are still faced to schemes, as Lenin mentioned, as explanation of the First World War, to a fight between empires. It looks like we are witnessing the world debacle in a fight between the Chinese empire and the North American empire, and who would be the main power of this new world order, and with the long 21st century, as Carlos mentioned in his title of his presentation. I am not political activist or communist militant. I just come as a regional director of labor, so my role is to express the questions that have to do with labor. This new world order, based, it looks, in a technological revolution, invites a question which is key for a Congress like this, and also invites us to what Carlos mentioned. The question is, what is the role of labor in this transformation and in this new world order? And then wondering whether there is a role that is playing, whether human labor is important in this new century as it was in the past century. Another question that could you could have an individual answer to, but I think individual answers need to be put on the table for a collective analysis, because you have your own ideas and your bias, etc. So the second question is this, and I want to develop with you, is that whether accumulation is still based on expropriation of labor, of human labor. If this scheme of capital work that was the scheme of the previous century is still valid to understand the imperialistic fights, the increase of the capital, if this is still based on the expropriation of human labor. And for this, I think Carlos's statement gives us a lot to discuss. First of all, for me, or for us, it's impossible to talk, but from our Latin American point of view. And Latin America, as well as Europe, experienced the 60s and 70s decades marked by events that were fundamental and that marked the relationships of labor and the relationships between capital and work. Although Europe was finishing their agreement of the Second World War, what happened in Latin America was the imposition of a neoliberal model, fire and blood, military dictatorships meanwhile, for accumulation of economical political power, the end of, as Carlos says, an industrialization system, and now it's based on imports. In the 70s, what happened? Probably you know, many of you might know, or maybe might have heard of. You are in the first country that was the experiment of the neoliberal model as it is known around the world. You're in Chile, right? With a dictatorship that was more bloody than the neighboring countries, but there was specifically particular. It wasn't protectionist. It was abandoning the industrial national class and sector to become and to apply neoliberalism and to integrate the international market. This is a very Chilean characteristic. That's why we have what we have, and happens what is happening. From the 70s, we still, as the labor work, we haven't been able to create the same level in Latin America that we have before the 70s. We haven't been able to improve as compared to the world, to the US or to Europe. So the end of the Second World War social agreement was a catastrophe at the world level for labor. This pact of the Second World War, this agreement of the social democrat capitalism that was based in a redistribution of the capital income, a redistribution that could have been successful. It was mainly based on an agreement where we redistributed the income by two systems. There was impositive tax redistribution, the rich would pay more taxes, and collective negotiation of workers in their unions that somehow would redistribute through their union work the capital income. In the 70s, this ended, mostly around the world, in US, in Europe, and this has led to the union world to disappear from the first line, political line, if you want, but also inequality has just increased. Because the far right, especially US and European far right, and Latin American far right, of course, we pay so little tax, it's not relevant if we say we will pay less. But one of the signs of the new far right is to attack the organized, the few reducts of organized working labor force, and reduce the tax burden to increase inequality even further, eliminate any redistribution mechanism in the country, etc. So those aspects added to the new world order, as Carlos mentioned, to the technological revolution, naturally places us in a new world order that invites to these two questions. Is labor still important in this new world order? And accumulation is still based on the exploitation of workforce, I'm just going to say a couple of things that I think are relevant for me to say today. It seems that labor has changed. It seems in Western societies from the industrial work to the intellectual work, if you want to call it somehow, or manual plus soft, and more linked to services that treat you as a service renderer, as an autonomous, like Rappi, Uber schemes, etc., that accumulate labor that is less qualified. But it seems that the union world, the unionized world, is based on services that imply qualification. It's not just him, right? This logo could be a Starbucks barista, or it could be a Uber driver, or a university teacher, if you want, in the logo, right? Because this new order, or this change in labor, it doesn't mean that labor loses the central role. We believe that labor, more than ever, people are living from the product of their own work. But what has changed is the capital. The capital from the industrial owners of companies, that they had this very specific stereotype with a fat aspect, mean guy, right? We go to societies by shares, where many workers around the world don't know who the owners are. But labor exists in Western societies, I'm saying that. There are many workers, but they are not in Europe or the US. They're in Asia. The workers as in the industrialized world in the past. When in a Western point of view, the factories have ended, but it seems, me not being an Asian knowledgeable person, that in Asia they have a very important industrial era, hand in hand with automation, but that uses workforce as never in the history of in their own history of humanity. And I would like to say also that it seems nowadays the union freedom is more necessary, and the exercise of this right and the exercise of the attributes of unions, collective negotiation, strikes, although strikes have less impact than in the previous times, and this naturally requires, as well as universalization of capital, it requires an international effort of those who are actors in the labor work. Nowadays, we don't have a big international organization of workers, but these type of instances will be very important so that us, from the academia or from the state, can give input to clarify what is the way, what is the path in order to rebuild a work based on the Republican ideals of equality, fraternity, liberty. It's a hard road. These occasions are important. From our institution, we intend to create these types of instances, and we really appreciate that academia also incentivize the talk about labor, because the labor is the source of our richness, both individual and from the society point of view. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Sergio, for your comments. So I guess there are questions from the audience, things you want to add to comments on both contribution from Carlo and from Sergio. Clearly, we know that labor is central to understand society, and we work all the time around it. But there is really a political issue in certain time of history. So why in certain time of history the labor movement has been stronger than in others, and why we need more alliances today. So these are also part of the big questions. Any questions, any inputs from you on this topic and these discussions? Ale?
Que lo siento mucho, pero voy a preguntar en inglés si puedo. ¿Sí? Gracias. Thanks for the presentation and the commentary. I think... sí. Thank you for your presentation and commentary. I think both in the presentation and perhaps indirectly in the commentary, you seem to be referring to the end of neoliberal globalization. And I do wonder if that is really the position that you want to take. And I'm saying this because there is a lot of evidence from a great number of sectors, classic labor-intensive sectors, where the declining share of labor have sort of very long historical trends that suggest that we are looking at yet another geographical movement, and we are looking at processes of re-outsourcing more than the end of globalization as we know it. An example from China, you made reference to a rise in wages, and so sort of that given rise to a change in the type of accumulation that China has. But if you follow evidence from the electronics industry, from the labor-intensive industry in textile and garment, you just see that there's forms of triangle manufacturing that leading now production and labor processes from China all the way to Cambodia, Jordan, Eastern Europe, as well as in the Horn of Africa. So I do wonder if we just fetishize too much a state-centered reading of what's happening. Is it really the end of neoliberal globalization? Thank you.
Sì, io penso che
I think, yes, there are processes which are being undertaken in the world economy. It would seem clear that the great strength that China has today is not more than in its capacity of producing cheap merchandise with cheap labor. China is making a structural change in order to make a new front based on a skilled labor force with great capacity to exert social pressure. And this movement in China of closing productive plants, localizing plants in other places, has generated movements, strong movements of protest movements in China, has led to protests in China. So there are conflicts and contradictions, but I think that the dynamics in the mid to long term, China is going to lead to a economy based on a skilled labor force with a capacity to exert greater pressures. The US, for example, which led globalization, is suffering the results of this type of bet. The pretension of creating value to the detriment of production, which the US tried to establish, given the fact that it had the currency that could overvalue or could or capture the circulating capital in the world in order to sustain its debt. This type of bets of separating the dynamics of the contemporary forces has been revealed as a disaster for the US. The US has, with Trump, has tried to deglobalize. Today, it's a country which tries to revert globalization, but in a way which unilateral and with lots of internal difficulties for its own population. A US which deglobalizes its companies would be a US which will reinforce the power of its working class, which had hitherto been destroyed. So this movement could go in that direction. What would seem to me clear is that this globalization based on the overexploitation of work is a globalization which each time in greater difficulties, political difficulties, and difficulties in establishing power relationships, which could be or may be sustainable in time. Although China may transit in two veins, in two fronts, seeking to reduce the global competition in its workforce, it would seem to me that China evermore is becoming or attempting to go to a transition to a highly qualified economy, where the evidence and where the social pressures would be ever increasing. Tenemos tiempo.
If there is somebody that want to contribute. Okay.
Gracias. En español.
Thank you for the expose, for the conference. Comment, question, reflection is to Carlos in this context of catastrophic tie break between degradation of North American capitalism and emerging power, which would be the Chinese way. In this tie break, from my point of view, it is more catastrophic, which has to do with the fact that both systems are based on a productive model which is unsustainable. So, in relation to basic premise, hyper-consumption where we have a climate crisis and ecological collapse, and this has a limit. Capital kills sheep as workers, Marx would say. And in this dispute, at the end of the day, the planet wins, not the capital. There's a limit given by limited resources, and if you could make a study in tendencies, projections with the resources used by all these models, whatever way you choose, based on a productive model, it has a limit. The data centers, the amount of water to store data, and all these different projects, products, you can see that there is a limit. At some point, when you have an equation with all these variables, there is a limit, given the productive model, which is based on hyperconsumption and on the consumption of superfluous. So my question is, how do you consider this variable within this geopolitical context of accumulation patterns, of this current accumulation patterns? How do you accommodate this? Right. Yes, it's an important point. I think that the question of material consumption in a space with a very important space in China, which is a space which has to do with the scarcity of the presence of poverty, the presence of underdevelopment, the presence of a world which is unequal, combining where China would be part of the poor countries. So there was a big effort to break technological exclusions technology would make in consumption, and Chinese society is transforming into that. Chinese society has an average income much greater than it did, than it used to. It has special consumption capacity. So the task of solving this is to a large measure done, or given the fact that they can deal with other challenges. So if we take, for example, who are the countries that lead the frontier, the technological frontier in the production of clean energies, China and Holland. China has 80% of clean energies in the world, and Indonesia 10%. Indonesia and China have 90% of production of clean energies. So this is a substantial change, and I think that the nature of these issues for what China is doing is the nature of the economy to based ever more on the consumption and materialization of intangible goods. This consumption of public services, health, education, culture, to be ecologically sustainable. So I think it's a big, profound change. And the most dynamic trends are not going to reproduce this of material richness. China up until 2009 has an economy, export economy, and then it changed. Given the crisis that the U.S. 2008 subprime was answered by China, giving a big injection of a packet of injection into the local market, so as to go into the technologies, investing into the technologies. So transformations in China are very big and considerable, and while in the U.S. is given its incapacity to compete with China, is seeking to veer in other extremes in the applications of the energy transitions. All of that is offensive, is into the renewal of political economy, carbon zeros, then negating the importance of ecological dimension. It's also taking up positions against sciences, cutting funds, research funds into development, research and development funds, cutting them out. So it's a reaction of a decadent power in terms of technology, ever more demanding of a new paradigm. It would seem that the technical scientific revolution is 2020. From 2020 onwards, becomes or turns into generating a new technological paradigm, which is the connection of biotechnology with technologies of information. The need is that up in 2050, the projections are that 2050, half the energy generated in the world would be produced by clean energies. The petrol, therefore, and its derivatives has more than 80% still of the generation of the world, still represent 80%. But China is preparing itself for a change, articulating a network, international network, which would go forwards in that direction. So I think that there are reasons to be optimistic in some changes that are being manifested that would have impacts in this. There are several aspects, but I think you have to have that identify those trends.
Thanks a lot. We are it's just about 11, so it's time for our first break. Before you leave, there are two news related to one. An important asado on Friday after we finish the conference. Many of you have already registered using the Google form we have provided, but the rest that want to participate and didn't fill the registration form, please do it now, because we need exact number for the catering people that are providing the asado for us. The asado is Friday around 7 in the Central Union building. And the second one is related to, our parallel session, which will start at 11:30. Look at the map just to find your building. We will be in 3 main buildings in the campus, okay? Okay, well, thanks a lot, and thanks to the speakers.